All right. Good morning, Senator Murray, and good morning to all of our guests. As we begin today, we acknowledge that the land we live, teach, and learn on is part of the traditional homelands of the Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Cayuse peoples, ceded during the Walla Walla Treaty Council of 1855. We recognize the continued presence and sovereignty of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation on the reserved lands near Pendleton, Oregon, and throughout the surrounding area, and acknowledge their stewardship of this land as we work alongside them today. And now it's my distinct privilege to introduce Senator Patty Murray, who joins the Whitman community for this important discussion on the effects of COVID-19, racism, and inequality. This event is part of our 2020 to 2021 academic theme of race, violence, and health. And we're so glad for this opportunity to have a conversation with the Senator on a report her office released last fall, which outlines how the American healthcare system has failed communities of color and how those failures have contributed to disproportionate and tragically high rates of COVID-19 death and infection. The report also offers recommendations on congressional action to address inequality and racism within the healthcare system. We'll begin with some brief remarks from Senator Murray, and then following that, three of our own fabulous Whitman students, Salma Anguiano, class of 22, Zidane Galant-LaPorte, class of 21, and Jasmine Razeghi, class of 22, will lead a discussion with the Senator. Senator Murray began her career in politics as a school board member. In addition to serving as senior senator and the first female senator from Washington State, she is now ranking member of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. First elected to the Senate in 1992, she's been a member of the Democratic leadership since 2007 and served as the first female chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee and the first female chair of the Senate Budget Committee. Please join me in welcoming Senator Patty Murray. Senator Murray.
Well, thank you, President Murray. I'm really glad to be here today and have a chance to talk with all of you. I know that Whitman College has been leading a really important conversation on race, violence, and health this academic year, and I'm really pleased to be a part of that effort. You know, early in this pandemic, I remember some people were describing COVID-19 as a great equalizer. That was so obviously wrong even then, and it really underscored for me the importance of shining a spotlight on how systemic racism was making this crisis more painful for communities of color and addressing that reality. So I've been working to listen to communities of color, tribal leaders, people in rural areas, essential workers, and others about the challenges they are facing and to make sure we are addressing them. The health equity report I put out last year shared some of what I've heard. For example, the story of a Black 8th grade teacher who said her community lacked tests as COVID-19 spread through it last spring, or a transgender woman whose friend really feared that she would be discriminated against for being transgender if she sought care for COVID, and who sadly ultimately passed away. And the son of a Latino meatpacking plant worker whose father contracted COVID and who struggled to communicate with his care providers about his treatment because of language barriers. So I am continuing to listen and push for action like I did with that report. Just before joining you today, I actually spoke with Joseph Saya with the Pacific Islander Community Association of Washington about the challenges that his community is facing, like how online booking for vaccines missed elders in his community. Last week, I held a health committee hearing on health equity and our COVID-19 response, where Abigail Echohawk, who's the executive vice president of the Seattle Indian Health Board, spoke powerfully about the challenges tribes in our country face. Those conversations have been really critical to my work to get people facing the worst of this crisis direct relief specific to their communities. We made progress in the American Rescue Plan by investing billions in vaccines and testing and community health centers, which are really a lifeline to our underserved communities, and teaching health centers, where we are working to recruit underrepresented people as healthcare providers and the Indian Health Service. And as you probably know, President Biden formed a COVID-19 Health Equity Task Force and recently dedicated $10 billion of vaccine funding to expanding vaccine access and building confidence in our underserved communities. But I know we have a lot of work ahead. We've got to make sure people can get vaccines and reliable information from sources that they trust, regardless of whether they have a disability or access to internet or speak English or other challenges. And after this pandemic ends, we'll have to rebuild a stronger and fairer for everyone. We've got to pass a federal sick family and medical leave policy. We need to rebuild our public health system with a focus on equity, including better systems to collect comprehensive demographic data and personnel at our health departments who are focused solely on equity. We need to recruit underrepresented groups for our healthcare workforce and for clinical trials. We need to provide people accessible, culturally considered help in their primary language to enroll in health coverage and understand public health threats and get care. We need to provide anti-bias training and strengthen workplace protections to stop discrimination. And we need to ensure coverage is truly a right, not a privilege, including for our immigrant communities. I don't expect progress to be easy. Getting this done is going to take everyone, including the students we're talking with today at Whitman, holding leaders like me accountable and having conversations like this one. But I want you to know this is really personally important to me, and I'm absolutely going to keep putting in the work we need to do to get it done. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Senator Murray. We're going to turn first to Salma Anguiano. She has the first question for you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Senator Murray, for joining us. Senator Murray, much like your father, my father was also not able to work since I was the age of 13 due to a work injury that left him permanently quadriplegic. I, at a young age, had to take on part-time jobs while attending school, and my mother had to juggle being my father's full-time caretaker and sometimes only getting 3 hours of sleep due to also working a full-time job simultaneously. When we navigated the workers' compensation system, I noticed a lot of inequities, and the system itself lacked a lot of accessibility, especially to undocumented communities such as ours. Your report has absolutely no mention of the subject of undocumented workers and their contributions to the essential workforce. Undocumented immigrants make up a very large percentage of the essential workforce. It's no secret that for many years, undocumented workers continue to work some of the most dangerous jobs in unsafe working conditions. There's a lot of room for our current workers' compensation system to be weaponized against this population and has been, especially in recent years during the Trump administration. These malpractices allow both workers and companies, as well as employers, to have little care in ensuring the workplace is safe and that employers have the necessary tools to perform their jobs safely. How do you plan to advocate for these communities and ensure that they have safe working conditions, especially during the pandemic, where there are more vulnerable and unsafe conditions that their employers simply aren't willing to invest in making safe?
Well, Salma, thank you so much for that question and for sharing your background. You know, this report focused mainly on our healthcare system, but it does acknowledge the great contributions of immigrant communities to our nation's health and economy. And it also noted that undocumented immigrants, unfortunately, have faced barriers to health coverage and access. One of our report's recommendations is to expand access to coverage for immigrant communities, including by making undocumented people eligible for coverage on the ACA marketplaces. And, you know, our report also calls for protecting workers on the job, including from COVID-19. I've been working on this with hand in hand with our unions, with our immigrant rights organizations, and many others who are standing with me in this fight for economic justice. Let me just say this. If a corporation is profiting off the labor of a worker, that worker deserves the same protections as any other employee, plain and simple. But we know that corporations are continuing to find new ways to evade our labor laws, and we've got to update those rules. So in addition, I have just introduced legislation that will close the loopholes that have allowed corporations to skirt their responsibility to make sure that basic workplace rights are held accountable when they violate the law. In particular, I've introduced the PRO Act, that's PRO Act. It is actually a sweeping piece of comprehensive labor legislation to protect workers' rights so they can stand together, bargain for fair wages, for better benefits, and safe workplaces. And more specifically to your question, under that bill, all workers will be protected against labor law violations regardless of immigration status. So I want you to know, I take this very seriously. It's something I've been fighting for many years. And I frankly will need all of your help to get this over the finish line. And I appreciate your passion and support and any help you can give me.
Thank you, Senator Murray. We'll turn next to Zidane Galant-LaPorte.
Hi, Senator Murray. Thank you again for being with us and having this conversation. We appreciate your time and energy. After looking at your report, the three of us noticed how the language in it, along with language used in our popular media, made it seem that not being white, young, wealthy, able-bodied, or straight is a pre-existing condition for COVID-19. Yet many policymakers right now are really focused on short-term fixes, stimulus bills, direct assistance that will theoretically remedy these conditions. But can you give insight to the public who are watching and to us right now on how we can really expect Congress to even begin to alleviate these structural problems when many of its members are unwilling to admit the influences of white supremacy, classism, ableism, and queerphobia in our laws, policies, and practices?
Well, thank you, Zidane. That's such a good point. And as the report notes, so many of the issues in our healthcare system are structural. And so our solutions have to be structural as well. They've got to address the systemic racism, the bias, ableism, sexism that really pervades our healthcare system, which is why my report doesn't just call for short-term solutions to the pandemic, like expanded testing and equitable vaccine distribution. Those are critical, but it also calls for direct investments in addressing health disparities, including specific funding to improve health infrastructure, provide support to communities of color to pursue healthcare careers, which is so important, and to support community health centers. And it goes beyond our healthcare system. We've got to ensure safe workplaces through a strong OSHA safety standard. We need guaranteed paid sick days and medical leave. We've really got to build a society that supports those that is historically marginalized. And I've long said that my goal this Congress is not just to get us back to normal, because normal was not working in the first place for too many Washington state families and people in our country. We have to take big steps to set the course towards a more fair and equitable country where everyone has a fair shot at success. So what does that mean, particularly as it relates to addressing these unequal structures? Well, to me, it means we have to tackle the biggest problems facing this country and our families holistically, like you said. And that means fighting for universal health care, making childcare more affordable and accessible for everyone, investing in transit and infrastructure, housing, education to make sure every child can live up to their full potential. And it means doing all of this with the understanding that equity is central to all of our work. And what I mean by that is that racial justice, for example, is not just about criminal justice reform. It is about healthcare. It's about jobs. It's about education and childcare and so much more. So as I work to write legislation for those important issues, know I am fully committed to addressing these issues in a way that is intersectional and always with broad input from a diverse range of voices and communities.
Thank you, Senator. And next we'll turn to Jasmine Razeghi.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for your time. My question is, it ties a bit to your response actually, but Washington State and the United States overall was not prepared for a pandemic, a situation that emboldened the disparities that you've discussed thus far. So what will you do to make a post-pandemic Washington look like in order to A, heal the state from the pandemic, and B, prepare the state from another disaster like coronavirus?
Well, Jasmine, you're right. We cannot just go back to normal after this pandemic because for too many people, normal wasn't working, as I said. And when it comes to this pandemic, in too many ways, normal failed. So we've got to address the lack of national paid family, sick, and medical leave that really meant millions of workers were not able to stay home if they were sick, and they were not able to take steps to keep themselves and their families and those around them safe. This was a huge issue for our essential workers, especially for workers of color. More than half of Latino workers don't have access to paid sick leave. So that means under current policy, they can't stay home when they're sick, they can't afford it. That has to change. I also think we have to end the cycle of a crisis of complacency when it comes to funding public health infrastructure. Investments that we are making to this crisis are important, but we cannot let the momentum die down after this pandemic is over. We've got to make sure we have a dedicated annual funding source for public health across the board. Like they say, an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure, because we know public health infrastructure saves lives. And the more we invest in preparing before a crisis strikes, the more lives we can save when one does, which is why I've actually introduced legislation earlier this month, actually, to invest in public health infrastructure in our country. Though there are many lessons from this pandemic, and we all have to look at them and learn from them. We can't afford to not learn from them. I'm actually, as chair of the Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee, going to be having hearings this year to look at our pandemic response and use that to help inform writing legislation that can help make sure that we are never in this position again, because we know this isn't the last pandemic we will see, and we need to be ready for the next one.
Senator Murray, thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights with us today. It's a privilege to have you with us. I hope we can bring you back, perhaps in person and for a longer conversation at some point down the road, but we genuinely appreciate you being with us.
I would love to do that, to have this over and we can all be in person again, and I'd love to see you and your students, and thank you for your interest in this and for your focus. It really means a lot to me.
Thank you. So now we're going to transition to a member of the senator's staff, Garrett Devaney, and continue with some conversation with him. So I'll turn it back to the students.
Hi, Garrett, sorry, I'm gonna have to push you a little bit more because that first answer didn't quite answer my question. I do understand that the senator is introducing new legislation